In the previous part, we walked together through the sunset of Olympus, when philosophy and then Christianity took turns stepping onto the stage, while the Greek gods slowly retreated into the shadows. The temples closed their doors. The oracles fell silent. But like every sunset, behind it there is not only an ending, but also a promise of another dawn. And that new dawn, for Greek mythology, is the quiet yet persistent journey of revival from the Renaissance all the way to the modern world we now live in. Try to imagine. You are standing in a European monastery in the Middle Ages. It is cold. The stone walls are thick. The only light is from small candles trembling atop a writing desk. A monk, wrapped in a brown robe, holds a quill and patiently copies line after line of Greek and Latin onto sheets of parchment. He does not believe in Zeus, does not pray to Athena, but he still copies Homer, still preserves the pages that tell of Achilles, Odysseus, Heracles. Those stories survive not in temples, but in books, not in crowded sacrificial rites, but in the hidden corners of a library, like a seed buried deep in the earth, waiting for the sky to warm again, for the rains to come, so it can sprout. Time passes. One empire collapses. Another dynasty rises and fades away. And then, in a corner of the Italian peninsula, something changes. People begin to lift their heads to look back at the distant past and ask a very simple question. Before us, who were there? How did they live? What did they think about the world? We call that period the Renaissance, which means rebirth. But what was reborn was not only art, architecture, or knowledge, but also an entire mythic world that had once seemed to vanish. In Florence, humanists like Petrarch and later Erasmus in the north began to hunt for ancient manuscripts. They combed through monasteries and archives, bringing out of the dust of time the works of Homer, Hesiod, Sophocles, Euripides, Plato. They did not read those works as liturgical books, but as doors opening into another spiritual universe, a world where human beings dared to ask questions, dared to argue with the gods, dared to build whole philosophies of life around beauty, goodness, and wisdom. In the cities of Italy, painting and sculpture workshops grew lively. Outside, the churches still echoed with prayers, but inside, on the walls and vaulted ceilings, a new layer of images began to appear. Botticelli painted the birth of Venus, a goddess rising from the sea, her long hair covering half her body, her gaze both shy and self-assured. Viewers might no longer believe that Venus is a real goddess, but they are still drawn into the question, what is beauty? What does our trembling before beauty say about us as human beings? Michelangelo painted powerful bodies on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Adam, the prophets, biblical figures, but their forms bear the imprint of Greek gods. Muscular, strong, vibrant. The human body is no longer shrouded in shame. It is honored, much as the Greeks once honored the divine shape of their gods. Myth, once again, steps out into the light. But this time it does not return as a religion. It returns as a kind of language of beauty, as a reservoir of imagery for art. The stories of Zeus, Athena, Dionysus are no longer used to explain thunder and harvests. They are used to speak of power, wisdom, passion, and chaos within the human soul. You can picture it. In a studio in Florence, a young painter holds a Latin translation of Ovid, reading the Metamorphoses, where humans turn into trees, stars, birds, stones. He looks up at the light falling across the wall and thinks, I can retell these stories with color, with brushstrokes. And so, paintings are born, one after another, so that hundreds of years later, people still stand for hours before them in museums, not to pray but to fall silent and feel a very ancient string inside themselves begin to vibrate. After the Renaissance, Europe entered another age, the Enlightenment. Science arose. People began to measure, calculate, classify, and write laws of nature. Reason was placed in a very high position. Thinkers like Voltaire, Diderot, and later Kant no longer saw myth as truth, but as allegory. Yet strangely, this very process of desacralizing myth was another kind of revival. When you look at Zeus and say, he is not a real god in the sky, but an image of the highest power of kings, of law, of social order, you have pulled mythology closer to everyday life. Hera is no longer just a jealous goddess. She becomes a symbol of honor, of family reputation, of wounded feelings. Athena is not only a goddess in the clouds, she is intelligence, reason, and strategy, the resources anyone needs, from a general to a mother, planning for her children. Myth now resembles a thick book of psychology, in which each character is a part of the human being. Thinkers read it, analyze it, peel away its layers, and realize the Greeks used stories about gods to speak of things for which they did not yet have abstract language. They spoke about freedom, fate, guilt, and justice, using images and symbols. Then, in the 19th century, stronger winds arise. Wars, revolutions, old orders shaking. People feel more alone amid industrial cities, factories, trains, and coal smoke. Romantic poets and writers begin searching for a language to express loneliness, the desire to escape, the deep sorrow each individual must bear. And once again, they turn to myth. In Prometheus chained to a rock, they see the image of the artist, the thinker, the rebel, the one who dares steal the fire of knowledge, beauty, or freedom from the hands of those in power to give to the people, then is punished, isolated, yet refuses to yield. In Orpheus descending into the underworld, they see the image of a lover unable to accept death, who uses art, music, and poetry to try to pull the beloved out of darkness, and fails because of one moment of weakness, one backward glance. In Oedipus, they see the modern human being, striving to understand the world and themselves, but the more truth they uncover, the deeper the wounds, the more painful the limits they discover. Myth becomes a mirror into which artists gaze to recognize what is happening in their own souls, in their societies. They write plays, poems, and novels, taking up those old names, but turning them into new questions. If Antigone lived in our time, what would she do when the law is unjust? If Sisyphus were an office worker, how would he feel having to push a rock of meaningless tasks up the hill every day, only for it to roll back down? Stepping into the 20th century, the revival of myth enters another, quieter yet deeper phase: psychology. Freud rereads the story of Oedipus and says, this is not only about an ancient king, but a basic psychological pattern in the child. Love, jealousy, fear, guilt in relation to parents. Jung goes further, saying, all myths in the world, not just Greek, are archetypal images, residing in the collective unconscious of humanity. According to Jung, when you read about a hero leaving home, passing through deep forests, meeting monsters, receiving help, descending into the underworld, and returning, you are reading about the human journey of growing up, from ignorance to awareness, from dependence to independence, from fear to acceptance. Hades is not only death, but the deep unconscious. Athena is not only a goddess, but the voice of reason. Dionysus is not only wine, but the instinct for ecstasy and chaos within us. Myth, then, becomes a map of the inner world. You may not believe Zeus exists, but you can still recognize that. Within you, there is sometimes a bit of Zeus, wanting to control, to command. Within you, there is sometimes a bit of Hera, wounded, jealous. A bit of Athena, alert, strategic. A bit of Dionysus, wanting to forget everything and dissolve into a drunken crowd. From there, therapists, writers, and filmmakers begin to use myth as a reservoir of symbols. They retell the old stories in new ways, in new contexts, while keeping the old structures. The hero, the journey, the trials, the failure, the transformation, the return. The audience may not label it the hero's journey, but as they watch, they still feel, why does this story feel so familiar? Why do I understand it even though it takes place on a distant planet or in the future? Because deep in the unconscious, we have known these patterns since the days we sat by the fire listening to myths. Modern science also has its own way of embracing myth. When astronomers look up at the sky, discovering new planets, stars, and galaxies, they still return to the old names: Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, Pluto, Atlas, Europa, Io. When humans send probes into space, they call them Apollo, Artemis, Hermes. An entire program to set foot on the moon is named after the god of light, music, and prophecy. You could say this is a strange revival. Greek mythology is engraved onto the real universe. Names that were once pure imagination now become the way we refer to actual physical objects in space. An icy moon, a giant gas planet, an asteroid belt. As if humans were saying, we no longer believe the gods live in the sky. But when we step into that sky, we still carry their names with us as a tribute. Then comes the literature, cinema, and comics of the 20th and 21st centuries, where myth enters the everyday lives of millions of people, often without them even knowing they are touching Homer. A child might first meet Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, not in a thick book, but in a children's series where the gods live in New York, argue like a big family, and their children go to a summer camp to train their skills. A young viewer might first learn of the Amazons not from Herodotus, but from a film about a warrior woman wearing a tiara, carrying a sword, stepping out from an island of women. These films and books are not faithful to the originals in a scholarly way. They change, cut, combine, and add. But they keep one thing: the feeling of a world where large forces, fate, love, war, family, are personified, turned into characters, so we can see them and understand them more easily. You may watch a movie where the gods wear modern armor and live in a city, but beneath it, the questions are still the same. If I am very powerful, what will I do with that power? Will I take responsibility for those weaker than me? Can I overcome the shadow of my parents, my lineage, my own past? And then myth slips into places that seem very far from it. Games, music, advertisements, brands. A pair of shoes named Hermes gives you the feeling of being swift, as if winged. An ad campaign uses the image of Atlas holding up the globe to evoke endurance. An album chooses Orpheus as the title for a ballad about someone who cannot let go of the past. You don't need to know all the details of the stories, but you still feel the aura of those names. If we look at this entire journey, from the Renaissance to the present, we see Greek myth has died many times and has also come back to life many times. It died when temples were destroyed and sacrifices banned. It revived in paintings and statues. It died when philosophy called it illusion, then revived as philosophical metaphor. It died when people dismissed it as primitive polytheism, then revived as a language of psychology. It died when it was thought to belong only in old books, then revived on screens, in children's stories, and in superhero characters. That tells us a very gentle yet profound lesson. Stories that truly touch the core of human nature do not vanish. They only change shape. Long ago, a Greek person sat by the Aegean Sea, listening to a blind poet tell of Odysseus lost at sea, and surely felt that anxiety. Will I ever return home after the storms of my own life? Today, you sit before a screen watching a film about an astronaut stranded in space, trying to find a way back to Earth. And you are hearing that same story again, only in a different setting. Long ago, a Greek mother told her child the story of Persephone descending to Hades, so the child could understand why winter comes, why flowers wither, why we must wait for spring. Today, a father tells his child the story of a girl who passes through a period of depression, then slowly comes back to the light, to friends, to life. The emotional mechanism is still the same: temporary loss, the waiting, and the hope of return. And for us, living in a world that is fast, noisy, and cramped, Greek mythology can offer a very simple gift: a slower rhythm. The moment you sit down to listen to these ancient stories, you are stepping out of the stream of news, notifications, and deadlines, placing yourself instead into a much longer current, the current of those who lived thousands of years before you. They too loved and hated, competed and feared death, and asked, "Who am I?" They answered with Zeus, with Athena, with the wars of Troy. We answer with films, music, social media posts, and therapy sessions. But the questions are the same. Perhaps that is the deepest meaning of this revival of myth. It is not about the gods returning to demand worship. It is about us realizing we are not alone in history. Every time we dream of a life greater than the one we have, we are continuing Achilles' dream. Every time we long to go home, but keep losing our way, we are walking with Odysseus. Every time we try to understand the wound in our family, we brush up against the shadow of Oedipus. Every time we choose to go against the crowd for something we believe is right, we stand beside Antigone. And who knows, one day people may speak of our age, the age of the internet, of artificial intelligence, of cities lit all through the night, as a kind of new mythology. The characters then may not be named Zeus or Hera, but something entirely different. Yet they will still carry the old fears, the old hopes, the old questions. In the final part of this journey of being lulled to sleep by Greek myth, we will try to pause and look back over everything we have passed through. From the birth of the universe, the age of the gods, the heroes, wars, journeys of return, fate, death, Hades, decline and revival, so that we can ask ourselves, what in all of that still lives within us? And how can those very ancient stories whisper one very small, very close piece of advice for your tomorrow?